question about what this is a picture of, this is actually a large telescope array in South America, I believe in Chile, where the high elevation and clear atmosphere are really great for observing stars. So let's begin. So advertising is a challenging industry. We do months of historical survey research. We do individual interviews, focus groups, trend watching, field research sometimes, and then we condense it all through this funnel into a tiny 15 or 30-second spot on TV or radio, or perhaps just one image in a print publication. So, as daunting as this process seems, however, it's not so different from what we actually experience on a regular basis in real life, which is that the most impactful statements come from someone who listens often and well. And when people feel heard, they listen too. So the elusive goal of advertising is to get people to listen to us. So this is a presentation about deep listening. The Richards Group have known all these things for a long time. So an article about the firm, which I came across recently, had this quote: "Some agencies push products, some sell ads. We tell truths. The truth, as you know, can set you free. It can hurt, it can make you laugh. It never fails to make you think, and it always makes you listen." So, the listening that I'm talking about today isn't just any listening. It's listening with a purpose, generating demand and positive attention for brands. I aim to show how methods taken from anthropology and psychology can help us do what we do even better, listening more deeply, interpreting more skillfully, and ultimately giving brands a new kind of life in public space. So why deep listening? I'll just tell you a little bit about my personal history and what got me into this. So when I was 12 years old, the movie Contact came out, starring Jodie Foster. It's about Ellie Arroway, a SETI scientist who spends her days scouring the noise and static streaming in from space to find patterns that might indicate the presence of extraterrestrial life. So I'm going to play a quick clip of Ellie listening. Unfortunately, we don't have speakers in this room, so I'm going to tilt this laptop this way, and hopefully you'll all be able to hear. So I thought Ellie was awesome, and she had this vision that it was overwhelmingly likely that extraterrestrial life was out there somewhere in the universe, and that we as humans had the privilege and responsibility to try to find it and make contact. One day she had the opportunity to actually hear a signal coming from the star Vega. And she goes on this wonderful journey to try to figure out what this signal means for humanity and for herself. She emerges from this journey with more questions than answers, but with a far deeper understanding of her place in the universe, and the movie ends with her encouraging children to take up the task of listening so that they can also partake in wonder at the vastness of the universe, which we haven't even begun to understand. So, that's how I got into deep listening. But what are we listening for? The answer depends what we're solving for. In the case of the Richards Group, we're solving for three major needs. So demand generation on the one hand, channeling existing demand toward existing supply, and more clearly defining and differentiating the suppliers. So in a nutshell, our goal is to sort of draw people out of their shells toward clearly defined targets and then direct the traffic. But arguably, now is a challenging time to be doing this. The increasing shift to digital media, where, as our own quantitative studies show, people barely click through ads, and the slowly declining cultural purchase of traditional channels like TV, radio, and print have actually shifted more of the onus of selling onto the product or service itself, which is now being sold more word of mouth via social networks, specialized communities, and search. Brand loyalties and flux as newly innovative products and services outperform older ones, and trend turnover accelerates. Yet, this rapidly changing market also creates demand for longevity, the tried and true, with customers occasionally rebelling against products that, or brands that shift up old, tried and true products too quickly. Also, the sales process itself is as important as what is being sold. So, this cartoon, The Oatmeal, about a year ago or so, posted this awesome cartoon about, what exactly is it that's going to make you buy? Well, we're starting really interested and then kind of going down the more like pushy and desperate the salesman seems. So that's a challenge as well. However, we also live in a time of some great advantages, particularly big data. We have increasing access to it, and we use it here at Richards. So more and more firms in every industry are investing in full-time just data scientists and professionals whose job it is to mine this data, much like Ellie, searching for patterns. So this is just an example of some things that I put together for our Home Depot team, showing that despite the economic recovery, remodels have actually seemed to go down over the past year. People are doing smaller projects rather than larger ones. And interestingly, DIFM, or Do It For Me, is slowly gaining as a percentage of the total, and vis-a-vis DIY, which this data, I'm still going to be cross-checking it with other sources, but it seems to corroborate some of the client's internal data, which potentially could redirect marketing strategy. We also have a wonderful social listening division here at Richards, and Rebecca Austin really helpfully put together some charts here showing spikes in the mentions of the Home Depot over the past year. Here it is vis-a-vis Lowe's. So we have a much larger share of voice, actually. And then this here shows the social affinities on social media between people who tend to follow Lowe's and the Home Depot. So, they're all kind of clustered around here in the center. So they're pretty similar, but there are some outliers, like auto racing and NASCAR seem to be pretty far on the Lowe's side of the spectrum, whereas information security and liberal politics more on the Home Depot side. Information security makes sense because we had the breach, but yes. So some of these things have less to do with branding than with just external events in the world that can impact these kinds of things. So anyway,
Christopher, we've had multiple game proposals in the aisles of.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. I think there was just one.
So, big data has enormous assets. It helps us visualize patterns changing over time. Some of these are actually imperceptible without the data, and we can slice it and dice it in many, many ways. So we can pick up on things that otherwise we'd never perceive. The that big data doesn't tell us why. Why are things happening when they're happening? And it has limited predictive potential. So it's mapping the past up to the present, but it can't tell us or give us insight into what might happen. And it also misses unquantifiable information. So this is where the social sciences like anthropology and psychology can actually come in and be really helpful. So I'll talk first about anthropology. What is cultural anthropology or sociocultural anthropology? The American Anthropological Association defines it as examining social patterns and practices across cultures with a special interest in how people live in particular places and how they organize, govern, and create meaning. I define cultural anthropology as the study of collective or shared worlds. So it's not enough that it's my world. We have to share it in order to call it culture. The main methods employed by anthropologists are ethnographic fieldwork, which means going to the place whose patterns and practices you will study in order to observe them firsthand. And, as part of that, participant observation. Not everyone does this, but many anthropologists do. And that just means engaging yourself in the patterns and practices of the place and group that you're studying. So anthropology is all about making your body the instrument. You're going in and using your five senses, your emotional reactions, your moral reactions, whatever challenges and quandaries you encounter in the field become part of your data set. So, why is this relevant? The anthropologist Clifford Geertz has this wonderful passage that he's very well known for, in which he draws on British philosopher Gilbert Ryle's question about twitches and winks. And Gilbert Ryle was trying to make the point that we can only understand if the involuntary contraction, or perhaps voluntary contraction of an eyelid is a twitch or a wink through context. So he called for something called thick description. And Clifford Geertz said that thick description is in fact what anthropologists need to provide us. That's the kind of the data, the service that they bring. So, so Geertz writes, consider two boys rapidly contracting the eyelids of their right eyes. In one, this is an involuntary twitch. In the other, conspiratorial signal to a friend. The two movements are, as movements, identical. From an eye on the camera phenomenalistic observation of them alone, one could not tell which was a twitch and which was a wink, or indeed whether both or either was twitch or wink. Yet the difference, however unphotographable, between a twitch and a wink is vast, as anyone unfortunate enough to have had the first taken for the second knows. The winker is communicating, and indeed communicating in a quite precise and special way. Number one, deliberately. Number two, to someone in particular. Number three, to impart a particular message. Number four, according to a socially established code. And number five, without cognizance of the rest of the company. I take issue with that last point, but that's just me. As Ryle points out, the winker has done two things, contracted his eyelids and winked, while the twitcher has done only one, contracted his eyelids. Contracting your eyelids on purpose when there exists a public code in which doing so counts as a conspiratorial signal is winking. That's all there is to it. A speck of behavior, a fleck of culture, and voila, a gesture. So the point of all this is that meaning is highly contextual. And big data can't represent this context. It's a context that you can only know by being there and knowing something about the culture. So what can this do for a brand? I'm going to actually draw from a book that was recently published by Christian Madsbjerg and Mikael Rasmussen, founders of the consulting firm Red Associates, which specializes in ethnographic research. And so we'll take a look at what anthropology did for LEGO. So in 2004, LEGO was in trouble. Just a few years ago, they had been the 5th top toy maker in the world. But by early 2004, they were hemorrhaging $1 million a day. In order to reverse this nosedive, their leadership decided that they needed to look past the big data and actually use social scientific methods, which included anthropology, but also philosophy, to figure out what to do. So their first step, and arguably the hardest, was deciding what question to even ask. The question they had been asking up until that point was, what toys do kids want? So their studies, like focus group studies, had seemed to show that kids were facing so much time compression that they no longer had the time for the lengthy dedication to building things out of little Legos that playing with Legos required. Plug-and-play toys seemed to be easier, and the violence in video games seemed, from their perspective, to be too attractive. Like, Legos just kind of seemed lame. They're a bunch of blocks. And so, even in focus groups, children tended to choose Mega Bloks, a competitor to Lego, over Legos because they were bigger. And the researchers running the focus groups knew that the kids actually preferred to play with Legos, but under the constraints of the group, they were making this other choice. So, in light of all this, Lego started deprioritizing their traditional brick and expanding out into other areas. So they started making action figures, video games, and even things like snap and play accessories and jewelry. And the brand became so diluted that, as one of the employees said, if you covered up the Lego logo, you wouldn't have been able to tell who made that stuff. And so they stopped actually benefiting in this process from the nostalgia effect, where parents weren't buying the toys anymore because they didn't remind them of the toys they had grown up playing with. And something the executive leadership did notice in the focus groups they participated in was that there was continuity between generations, that kids often did like the same toys that their parents had liked. So Lego was losing all of this. So finally they decided to change the question. The CEO, Jörgen Vik Knudtorp, decided to ask a different question. What is the role of play? And to answer this much bigger question, he deployed like armies of anthropologists. He sent them to live with families in LA, in New York City, in Chicago, Munich, Hamburg, for many months. And these families, they went shopping with grandparents, with parents, with kids and their friends. They created like photo books and asked the kids to arrange the pictures and tell stories with them. They watched all the TV and movies the kids watched and like tried to analyze them. They talked to child development experts. They looked at children's play spaces. And then finally, when they were done collecting their data, they put it all through software program that allowed them to code and map it all, and they started coming up with patterns. So all these anthropologists would get together in groups and try to brainstorm together what patterns they had all seen, so that they weren't just drawing on the common sense that they had come into the field with. And this resulted in some striking observations about 21st century childhood. So the first observation is that the space of play for children had actually dramatically shrunk. So this is kind of what it is today and what it used to be. One of the things the anthropologists noticed was that children's rooms looked staged, like suspiciously clean, or like they were out of the pages of Elle Decor. Not like rooms that children were actually living in. And culturally, they observed that these children were being, ferried by SUVs to, all of these carefully managed after-school activities. Their lives were very regimented because their parents were actually trying to stage their children's development in a certain way. So they wanted children who were creative, fun, outgoing, humorous, intelligent, and quiet all at the same time. And so kids were like hiding stuff from their parents, not just in the online gaming world where the acronym POS stands for parent over shoulder, but one little boy took a researcher into his room to show him his most prized possession, and he pulled out from under the bed his shoebox, which contained magic poisonous mushrooms. And this was his great secret. Another child who was asked to design his ideal room filled it with all these booby traps and like secret doorways. All of it seemed to be communicating, stay away, stop watching me. The children were suffocating. And so the draw of video games and their online worlds wasn't so much the violence as that these were spaces where they could play and encounter real danger without their parents. Children were really protecting this space, the space of play, the last space of play that they had available to them. The other thing that the social scientists noticed was that play establishes hierarchy. So in their worlds, the kids had extraordinarily complex systems of hierarchy, which were evaluated and reevaluated on an ongoing basis. So some of the boys would just rattle off endless statistics about all the players on their fantasy football teams. Other groups of boys would just every day compare their video game scores. And although these were more kind of male spaces, there are, of course, many girls who play video games. They often go by male handles to avoid sexism. But the same thing happens in more culturally female play spaces. We've all seen Mean Girls. There's studies now about like Instagram codes, which are these detailed systems of designating who's on top and who's on bottom of my friend's hierarchy. And so the team discovered that just as animals use play as a means of establishing social order and hierarchy, so too do children. And of course, children are only doing this in preparation for the adolescent and adult worlds, where play is also used to establish hierarchies in ever more sophisticated ways. So play is a preparation, actually, a kind of instinctive preparation for adulthood in many species. Finally, skill acquisition. So researchers noted that children play to achieve mastery at a skill. An 11-year-old German boy showed a researcher his most prized possession. It wasn't a shiny new toy or video game. It was a beat-up old sneaker. He lovingly pointed out all the ridges and nooks along the side and the bottom. They communicated to his friends that he had mastered a particular skateboard trick. And so this observation utterly challenged LEGO's presupposition that kids only want to do things that are easy. In fact, they want to do things that are hard for long periods of time. But those things have meaning to them, have to have meaning in a particular world. Gaining social rank is a part of that, what gives these activities meaning, but it's not the only part. The activities are also pleasurable in themselves, and they give kids a sense of mastery that builds up their trust in themselves and their confidence. So, what did LEGO do with all this information? Ultimately, LEGO decided to make toys for kids who like playing with Legos. That is, building with little bricks that takes a lot of time. But they also mixed it up. They leaked online hacks where kids could take innocent-looking toys like a fire truck and turn it into something more dangerous like a weapon. They established the LEGO Clubhouse where people at higher skill levels could mentor people with lower skill levels. They also started going to conventions of adult fans of Legos to learn how different people were thinking about their products. So the company actually reversed its turnaround, but at the expense of expanding into adjacent markets. So they decided that they were going to continue doing the thing they did really well, and not put their efforts into trying to vastly increase market share in the toy market as a whole. So, as the story of LEGO and the recent popularity of Minecraft shows, kids want to do hard things. And those are often things that mean the most to them and to others in a demarcated social world. Of course, as people get older, they keep doing these things. They keep participating in separate worlds of meaning that are defined by certain passions and skills. These are worlds where love, competition, and hierarchy overlap, and outsiders can only understand with difficulty. We sometimes call these subcultures, but they can also be called market segments or even industries. So for some global companies like LEGO, it pays to think like they're selling to micro markets. When kids who love to build things stopped buying their products, LEGO knew they were in trouble. For other companies like the Home Depot, that might be a little different, because people aren't just aficionados. They need to do lots of things that they may not want to do, and they want them done preferably well. So the Home Depot sells both to passionate DIYers and to people who want to pay people to do things for them. So unlike LEGO, what it is selling is not the love of building, but home improvement, a process which means different things to different people. And I personally think that actually ethnographic investigation of both DIYers and DIFMers could shed a lot of light on how the Home Depot could market to these different customer segments. Okay, so we've seen what anthropology can do for a brand. How about psychology? see the American Psychological Association definition of psychology as the study of mind and behavior. The discipline embraces all aspects of the human experience, from the functions of the brain to the actions of nations, from child development to care for the aged. So when we think about the cross-application of psychology to advertising, perhaps we most often think of consumer psychology. It seems the most immediately relevant, and it looks at things like the discrepancy between people's attitudes and their behaviors. So our team actually did some work on this recently when we looked at the phenomenon known as Christmas creep. So every year, people complain that companies are advertising earlier and earlier for Christmas. In a phone survey this past November, something like 72% of people said that companies advertise too early. And many of these people say they will never buy from a company that does this, et cetera, et cetera. However, according to PayPal, the holiday shopping season officially began on September 30th, when they saw a payment increase spike of 60%. And about 40% of people, according to the same surveys, have started Christmas shopping by Halloween, 50% by Thanksgiving. So, like, there's some funny phenomena too, like the Chicago area's #2 radio station, WLIT 93.9, always gets complaints whenever it switches to its all Christmas music format that's coming too early, but it like doubles its listeners on the day that it does. So this is something interesting. This is kind of like big data psychology. Like, we're looking at mass phenomena at a large scale. But can brands benefit from another type of psychology, one that looks at the depth of the individual person? I think that they can. So, as we were just saying, psychologists have long observed that people seem to be at odds with themselves. They say they want one thing, but they do another. Circumstances often have a strong effect on what people want or think they want or actually do. So surveyors have long observed, to their frustration, that people start to kind of tell them what they think they want to hear as soon as the process called taking a survey is initiated. Like we saw in the Lego example, children in focus groups tended to choose the Mega Bloks because of the environment they were in. The fact they had to make a decision. And so some psychologists have argued that this means each person is actually multiple people, that there's no one self who's always in charge. And of course, pop culture has a lot of fun with this notion, multiple identities, which in extreme cases is actually a diagnosable illness called dissociative identity disorder. But other psychologists, like Carl Jung, have argued that there is, in fact, a self, a unified self in each person. It's just a very mysterious self that we don't know very well and can't define. So, as this diagram shows, Jung thought that most people are consciously aware only of the persona that they present to the outer world, which is really a tool used by the ego as a kind of way of interfacing with the environment. So the persona, as well as the wider ego that creates and deploys it, are things that people most comfortably describe when asked to talk about themselves. So it's, I am this, I am that. People may even recognize that they have multiple personas that they use in different circumstances and be able to cogently describe all of them. And these personas aren't necessarily ideal qualities. They're just things we identify with, which usually are comfortable to us and they've stood the test of time. However, Jung also thought that beneath these conscious personas is something called the shadow. Oh, there it is, the shadow. So the shadow is all the things we are not, or that we say we're not. And these tend to be things that we really don't want to be. These can be good things as well as bad things. The value judgments we bring to them are rather arbitrary. So, for instance, some people may be so convinced that they're bad that they place any instance of being good in the shadow. They do a good thing, I don't believe it, I immediately disavow it. So good and bad are really relative categories. Jung also believed that the shadow appears in dreams as both masculine and feminine characters. So the anima is the feminine and the animus is the masculine. And that all people have both masculine and feminine sides to their shadow. And these don't reflect actual male and female qualities. They're just symbolic ways often influenced by the culture of talking about polar opposite characteristics, which Jung thought each person has or needs to have in order to be whole. So there's a lot here for advertisers to play with, and they certainly do. Some advertising works by really playing to people's egos, as well as to their personas, reinforcing the things they really think they are or desperately want to be. A lot of gender-based advertising, for instance, is about reassuring both men and women that by purchasing and using certain products, they are, in fact, the men and women they claim to be. There's also advertisers are very good at advertising to the shadow. So speaking directly to people's insecurities, weaknesses, and darkness, which sometimes becomes direct enough to it's almost like they're explicitly addressing those things. But for Jung, it's not enough to just speak to the shadow or play with it. You actually have to integrate it into yourself, accept that it's a part of you, and bring it in so that your personality, yourself, can be whole. And he believed that by doing this, we become better people, we have more positive impacts on the world. And I think that the importance of speaking to the shadow is part of what our story of Lego demonstrated. So children have an instinctive sense for the importance of darkness in their lives, danger, uncertainty, violence, which their parents have largely disavowed. I mean, they haven't come to terms with, and so they want to eliminate in their children as well. But children protect the spaces in which their shadow is free to be. And Lego recognized this by creating these online spaces where children could find resources for the shadow. However, Lego made another decision, not to endorse rebellion against parents. In other words, they tried to find ways to incorporate the shadows of childhood, while also emphasizing the positive process of building things, which is what Lego is about, and being part of a family. So it's commonplace to say that people define themselves in relation to the images they see in the media. I suspect that by bringing the darker side of human beings in conversation with the more visible ego ideals to which we often aspire, advertising can actually be a healthy force in the culture. And by making people feel more deeply heard, it encourages them to listen. So I contend that any healthy brand should be able to speak to both dark and light aspects of human experience. The darkness gives a brand depth and believability, makes it feel more real and human, while its light side shows the positive difference it makes in the world. Things that it enables people to do, the great experiences it allows them to have, and all of this gives a whole new meaning to integrated branding. And I draw on this Latin word, integer, for entire, that healthy brands have integrity, they know who they are and base their yeses and nos on this, and are integrated. They speak to both light and dark aspects of human life. So, if our goal is to bring all of who we are, that integer, that entirety of who we are to our work, and for the creative solutions we provide for our clients to be as deep and comprehensive as they can be, this commitment to the entirety of our experience is important. We live this commitment through deep listening. This means that we use everything from statistics to our own bodies to collect data, and then use our interpretive ability, which over time becomes something like wisdom, to distinguish meaning from noise. We do this all in service to people, so to our clients and our society as a whole. Ultimately, that is the purpose of the social sciences, like anthropology and psychology, using evidence-based insight to make the world a better place. Thank you. Opening it up for questions.
What's your personal background that draws you to be interested
in anthropology and psychology? Well, I don't know, were you here for the contact portion of
Yes.
the presentation? Okay, so I think probably since I was just really little, I've been fascinated by this notion that beneath the kind of surface level of our experience, there are deeper layers, and that if we pay close attention, we can hear or perceive some of these deeper things, which kind of help us understand what's going on.
What did you do before you came to Richards?
I was in a PhD program in anthropology and history. And so I was doing this ethnographic field work in Poland, looking particularly at people's experiences of religion.
This is like catnip.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna jump in. So first off, there's often there's a lot of bitching that sometimes happens about Stan won't send us to planning conferences and we can't go off and whatever. But something like this, I would argue, is far superior to anything that the experience outside. And plus, you don't have all the headhunters in the room. So I think you've raised the bar in terms of applicable content, for a lot of these things, which I think is really cool. One of the things that is fascinating yet also incredibly frustrating is our ability to translate these types of points of view and models and interpret them in a useful way to the teams that we work with, whether they be the clients, creative teams, whatever. There's a level of translation between the two that in some cases is incredibly mysterious.
Yeah.
When you have someone sitting across the table who says, listen, which one does Stan like? Listen, I think this one's cool. And you've got that type of like a binary, response as to what I'm going to use, what I'm going to accept, what I'm going to move ahead with. It presents an interesting challenge, but a unique one in the sense that if you can build a lot of your strategies and thinking ahead of time on these models and give yourself enough time to then interpret and package it in the right way, like we plan internally, we plan our internal models.
Yeah.
They could most likely, I think, make for so much more clear and substantial recommendations that we provide. But that's the big trick. And
Right.
I've had a couple of opportunities where I've been successful and a couple that have been dismal failures. And it all, the variable that I see consistent is the distance I put between the team I'm working with and this information. The further away I can keep them, but leave it in, the more effective. The closer they get to it, it starts to call into question everything that they know and want to be right to make their job easier day in, day out. And just, it kind of blew my mind last night. There was an old episode of Radio Lab, a rerun. I don't know if you guys listened to that last night. And essentially, it was pretty much a lot about this various content about how people make decisions. And one of the psychological experiments that they reported on was a guy who would go out onto the street and intercept people with essentially a fake survey. The survey was, by the end of it, the survey essentially was trying to figure out how much do you like me? But before ever administering the survey, the guy did one thing. He asked them to do a favor for him really quickly. And it was one thing to hold his beverage for a moment while he shuffled into his bag. However, what he did is he changed the beverage. And it was only one or two, it was either iced coffee or hot coffee. Inevitably, based on nothing other than the unconscious reaction to a warm beverage in one's hand versus a cold beverage in his hand, was an absolute predictor of whether that person was going to, in the end, like them or not like them. Now, and there are several other examples. And when you start to take enough of that stuff in, you really feel as if this job is entirely useless. A pointless experiment in trying to convince people that you know what to do with their money, when in fact the real decisions might be made by forces completely outside of our control. And if ultimately we're trying to change people's minds and persuade them, and that happens in one's brain, and we don't know anything about the brain or have an allergic reaction to bringing this type of learning into the process, this is a grand kabuki theater where we spend budgets before the end of the year, make certain we sign in by 8:30, and can't wait for retirement. I'm serious. And we're going to get to this event horizon pretty soon where this type of information is going to be so accessible to other agencies and our clients that maintaining a flat earth philosophy on how advertising and brands can truly persuade people will be just that, a flat earth point of view, which at some point has a fairly dire ending. So anyway, that's, you've hit me at a time with this content where I'm vulnerable.
That's the best way to receive something, I think.
A question, I think somewhat based on one of Christopher's points, I think everyone in this room would all largely agree, like the layers, right? That's something we're all interested in, and you know, given a very tantalizing topic that drew us all in here. But especially in your sort of work in Poland and as I guess as it pertains to religion, but all the cultural field work you did, people that are not sort of this type of person, do you think that they sort of acknowledge that the layers exist and don't? And so taking it to the creative example, right? I mean, I concur completely when I say the closer that I bring all of the knowledge that I know will make the work better, the sort of more it's rejected, right? So do you think that people that don't see the layers, or they know the layers exist and don't want to acknowledge or be interested in them, or trying to understand the dynamic that the creatives, right? From my point of view, why would you not want more information that could make your work that much more powerful?
Right.
That's not the sort of, like that creates a tension, not a positive tension. So.
Right. Well, and I think the first layer of my response to your question is that, yeah, I mean, people tend to fear this notion that there are deeper layers. And so if you're pointing that out, they would rather not acknowledge but continue to function from, and that's why some of this darker advertising is so effective. Because people in their day-to-day lives would never admit that they want these things, but they do. And so I think this is why the field of psychotherapy was formed, or like psychoanalysis was formed, is that there was a systematic recognition that people feel well because they refuse to acknowledge everything that was behind the curtain. But I think another aspect of it is just that what do you do? I mean, once you do acknowledge these things, where do you go from there? I mean, very much like Chris was saying, where does that leave us? And I think that this is where something like a positive account of health gives us some direction. So, for instance, the example of a brand actually speaking to these kinds of darker things that might be bringing people to them, but not simply identifying them with them, so that people are ashamed to admit that they're drawn by this advertising, but to connect that with the positive things that are bringing them as well. I think it's very difficult, and I think there's a lot of tension there that is potentially very generative, but I think people have to be open to doing real creative work.
It's like a fight-flight response.
Yeah.
I think in my history, I've only had 2 clients that I think are even willing to entertain any of this. And even then, success is, did I get home in time to kiss the kids or get to my yoga class? To get to the next day to pay the mortgage. And so the layering of seeming complexity on top of a rote decision-making process, when in fact it's about trying to appease or mollify the structure that they're working in, whether it be layered or whatever it might be. It's trying to find the connecting point between the two.
And I think what you said, to your point about you being the one to do the translation, so you're not doing, they don't realize that you're translating. Making that process maybe more opaque, less transparent, unless they've really signaled that they're open and receptive to it. I think that can be extraordinarily helpful, because these people might not actually want to know how the sausage is made. They might not want to know all the things that you're bringing. They just want you to make it rain, or do whatever you do, And so there is a real sense in which this is kind of like looking at code, like the HTML, but people want to look at the website.
early stages of a project group, what we're trying to do, work with Scott Reed, who's our head of analytics, do a really complicated project to understand the factors, advertising factors that drive sales. And by sales, I mean short-term, this week, immediate sales. What we're realizing is one of the factors is, are we inspiring people to take on home improvement projects? Right? And there's a bunch of other more rational things, but there's this really interesting phenomenon of, did we inspire people? So my point is, there's an entry point that allows us to say, what does it take to do that, and get into some deep listening to understand what is inspiration.
Right.
So my point is, if we just said, let's study inspiration, we're going to say, what? We're driving sales over here, and you guys are crazy. We say, well, no. We've put these pieces are coming together in a really interesting way. When we study what it takes to drive short-term sales, like this weekend, one of the factors is this fuzzy thing called inspiration. Let's go study that.
Yeah.
So we get to that. Right. So that's where your point of, we have big data, and it's not wrong, but it's not enough. Right? Because your point, it doesn't answer why. But even the interpretation that big data says, maybe even here's the question to ask. Right? This is the really interesting question to ask. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the permission to ask the question. We wouldn't know even that that's the right question. So our job, I think, becomes really smart, in saying we have all this data over here. There's a great term I heard a long time, is that each of us is churning out massive quantities of data exhaust as we go through day-to-day life. Just spewing out this information about what we're doing, what we're looking, what we're buying, pages we're viewing, and what we're typing in, and all this stuff. Combine all of that with all the survey stuff. Right. Then you get the point of, okay, what are we really listening to? Right. Because we just went to the Home Depot and said, we need to study what's the role of home. Right? They would say, we don't know what to do with that. Right? I don't know why that's the right question. Because I don't know what problem it's solving. But if we then put together the little formula I just said of what drives sales, one piece of inspiration, now that we don't go after that.
Right.
Maybe that's the way forward. Making it sensible.
It's in some ways it's taking this belief system, which I would call that to a certain extent. Although I don't know if it's something you believe in, you either understand it or you don't understand it. It's not as if it's some fairy tale thing that you decide to believe in. But to use the same model on our clients, to understand what is their flavor of persuasion. I mean, just at the superficial level, I have clients who hate qualitative research. Don't believe, don't buy, don't subscribe to it.
Yeah.
I have others, and so it's not that they're illiterate. It's not that they don't like the literate. It's that they perceive in being more numerate is safer, is a better firewall to make decisions. Which all gets then back to their own personal safety and security within their specific job position. Because they're into their 50s and can't go through the process of finding a headhunter to get them that next gig for that amount of money. And yet their kids have to go to college.
Right.
And so if you really wanted to lean into what is going on, so many of the meetings and things that we're going into, applying some of this on the backside of the fence, and I have no idea how to do this, might set us up for those instances where we know, do not tell this person that our golden question for 2015 is answering truly what is home. Right. Because it'll never happen. But this person would sign off on said project based on this rationale in certain ways.
Ironically, that's really good account management or brand management, right? I think one of the most beneficial things I've discovered is when I go to a client is to first just understand the hierarchy of their organization and sort of the methods and madness that the leadership uses, right? But where it's interesting in doing what you're talking about is thinking about that as applying to the Richards Group, right? And specifically sort of the micro agencies that exist within the Richards Group, the creative teams and that, right? That to me is where you start to say, okay, that's how I can really affect the creative work, right? I could sort of put a seed in the inspiration component, right, or in the concepting component rather, and try to grow some of this into the concept as opposed to, as you've experienced, right, guys, you need to make sure to do this, 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 and this. Well, I'm either afraid of that, or it doesn't make sense to me, or I don't believe you, or whatever the case may be. Therefore, I'm just gonna write a funny spot and sell the hell out of it.
I mean, this subject, this is the dark arts in our discipline, and it's the thing that happens 24/7, 365 a day. yet we allot zero amount of time to
That's
sharing
what
the
it-
best practices, talking to one another, and sharing it and going through it.
I think that's what it all boils down to, is time, right? I would bet, like, if you look at all your...
Time that can be accounted
Well,
for.
yeah, right. In this organization. But if you look at sociology and anthropology, what do? They spend months, right?
Yeah.
Months in, like, we're in an industry alone where PACE is what's going to do to drive sales tomorrow. But then we're also in an organization where, what would you put? Deep listening, right? That needs to be a job number on every client, right? If you're in construction, right? You can build. I think you can fairly bill it to your clients if this is planning work, but it's more so the pace of the industry. I don't know how you.
It's definitely planning and not reacting. And
Yeah.
most of the work we do is account reacting, not
Yes.
planning. So when the notion of we're going to answer the question, when is home? You know, if there's not a 3-day paint sale that's riding on the decision in the coming years, and it's going to benefit from that. But maybe that paint sale next year or next season or whatever, there could be a meaningfully different input that goes back and shifts how we approach that. You know, it's like forging a way for that wonderful winter that might happen in that sense.
I think one of the dangerous things we assume is it's just too hard to get really big, complicated, expensive projects approved, so we don't try. Two of the coolest projects we did at Home Depot combined for a sample size last year of 24 people, 23. You did one. And all you did was put a whole bunch of advertising work on a table and had contractors spread it around and talk about it. And in fact, we had 12 contractors talk for an hour each in great detail what stuff they would pay attention to, what stuff they wouldn't pay attention to. It was incredible. We referred back to that study over and over and over again as we figured this work out. The other one is a combination of planners and digital strategists went into people's homes and they said, tell us about how you use devices in your life in general and as it relates to home improvement projects. We talked to 12 people in depth. And again, the content of that keeps coming up in conversation. So, and none of that qualifies deep listening, but it would at least qualify as human listening.
Active listening.
Yes, active human listening. And so my point is, both of those cost a maximum of $3,000, easy to get approved, and they all qualified as listening to human beings, as opposed to getting past all this work we're doing, where we're just looking at numbers.
Well,
And so my point is,
yeah.
it's a way for us to edge our clients closer to allowing us to do the kind of work that we need to do to get the insights that we can get to by walking in there slowly and starting slowly.
And I think some of the things that we've all been pointing to is what we actually saw in the Lego study, where children were protecting their darkness. So what you call the dark arts, or what you said, there's all this stuff that people are functioning from they don't want to talk about. Like all of that is like the question that I'm always most interested in is what are you protecting? And if we can begin to look at that, from an institutional standpoint, we can begin to see what kinds of pressures are being brought to bear. Because the children were protecting their darkness, under the influence of enormous pressure from, parental oversight everywhere. So what pressures are we functioning from as an industry, and what pressures are our clients functioning from that they might not want to talk about or even be consciously aware of? But it's those places that create the openings. Like if you create an opening there, you've disrupted an industry. So I think that's our task.
But not even just with our clients. I mean, I feel like to Matt's point, internally too, like we sometimes are afraid to ask the big questions, like what if spherical isn't the right answer? Well, of course spherical is right, so that's what we always do. I don't know that culturally all of us feel comfortable asking those sorts of questions and pushing ourselves, which therefore would push our clients.
Hey guys, we're almost out of time. We need to provide presentation feedback quickly, so real fast.
Okay.
You must be hired. If you're not hired, you will know I have been fired. Challenging, provocative, a story well told, etc., etc., etc. Explain that.
Wow.
I think you put too much pressure on yourself. I don't know that for sure, but you know this stuff inside and out. You've spent time living this, and in the beginning, you found your pace. In the beginning, you were a little bit visibly nervous, but I think that was pressure that only you put on yourself. I mean, this audience was with rapt attention. So I think sort of assuming a position of authority. I know that, you might say, well, I'm an intern or I'm new here and I'm presenting to this group, but you were the person that you're one of the most knowledgeable people about this topic, and it certainly had some of the most real world sociology and anthropology experience. I don't know everyone here, but so I think you can just come in with more confidence in yourself, which I think would just sort of help you hit your pace a little sooner.
I think these models as presented actually could be labor saving in the work that we do. It doesn't have to be posited to some type of like running up the tower and staring at the navel for 6 months with some undisclosed amount of money.
Right.
I mean, there are things that are known, there are systems in place that in fact could accelerate learning or getting into a specific, understanding. So I like the fact that you make people, I know there are people in the room right now who are uncomfortable. There are people who are like, oh shit, I can't do any of that. I can't say any of that. I felt that way. We all need to feel that way more often. And our culture, for as peaceful as it is not good at appropriately upsetting one another. And we need our snuggie revived.
We are conflict avoiders.
So the more of that you can bring, and here's the trick is when you get hired, your golden period will be your first 60 to 90 days, where you can provide the most good.
Okay.
The acculturation and assimilation of the board will begin on day 91. The goal is to stretch that out as long as you possibly can.
Yeah.
We're out of time.
Thank